Hello everybody and welcome to the brand new series of the Spin the Wheel Doctor Who podcast. I'm Will Templar, your host, who is very ill right now, so I can only apologise for the state of my voice. This is the longest I've ever been ill. I've been ill for 3 weeks now, so do forgive me. Hopefully I'm better for the next episode. But joining me for this series is none other than Jamie, Mario Bowser 494. Hello Jamie.
Hello, hello, hello.
Hello man, so for the next 6 weeks we will be returning to our original format of the Spin the Wheel podcast. So effectively what we did was put 5 stories onto a wheel. We span it and 5 stories each, didn't we? It was me and you, so 10 stories accumulative, and then we just span it, and then whatever the story that it landed on, we were to rewatch and then review on an episode of this. So we have like 3 or 4 guest episodes coming up, and again they also inputted their 5 episodes, so for those episodes there'll be 15. So there's not like a bias or anything like that. We're honestly just spinning the wheel, seeing what it lands on and talking about it. So I believe this was my pick, Jamie?
For the Empty Planet, this one.
Was it you?
I picked this one for the spin-off story.
Oh, okay. So, of course, the format was 1 good story, 1 bad story, 1 modern Who, 1 classic Who, and a spin-off. And the spin-off can be, of course, Sarah Jane Adventures, Torchwood, or Class. And I believe we both chose the Sarah Jane Adventures, but you went with the Empty Planet.
Yeah, you chose Temptation of Sarah Jane.
Oh, of course. Unfortunately, both written by Gareth Roberts. I think we should address this right now. We don't approve or condone anything that the writer has done. We're literally just reviewing the episode. Of course.
Basically, just go back to the Wedding of Sarah Jane review. Just scroll in to find Mike's big anti-bigot speech. That basically sums it up better than we can do.
Exactly. I'm surprised you can actually remember that. So if any of our audience can remember that, hats off to you guys. But yeah, that was a really nice speech. But nevertheless, it's unfortunate because Gareth Roberts wrote so much of the Sarah Jane Adventures. And recently, yesterday for us, it was brought back on BBC iPlayer. And how did you watch it? Because I watched it through the box set, and then today I just chucked it on iPlayer because I couldn't be bothered to get a disc out again. But how did you watch it?
Well, years ago, when I watched all the Sarah Jane Adventures, I borrowed a box set off of one of my friends. I haven't seen that friend in years, so I can't ask for the box set back. So instead, I watched it last week, specifically on Friday, and I watched it on Daily Motion. Don't tell anyone. It's the only way I could think about doing it. So yes, I did have to put up with ads. And then, what do you know? Once I've already watched it, then the BBC decides to put it on iPlayer. Thanks a bunch. I'm only joking. I'm glad it's fun in iPlayer. But get Curse of Clyde Langer on iPlayer as well.
Absolutely. That's one of the best stories of the whole show, and it just isn't on there. And apparently, it was the same with BritBox. Apparently, the Sarah Jane Adventures was on BritBox, but I didn't even know that. But apparently, Curse of Clyde Langer wasn't even on BritBox anyway. So it's like kind of repeated itself with iPlayer. So maybe it's like a rights issue. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it can't be because of the subject matter, because I think it's an important episode for people to watch. So I'm just going to chalk it up to rights issues then.
But nevertheless, so we both had the chance to watch it. And Jamie, initial thoughts? I can imagine, like me, it was the first time you've watched it in many, many years.
Yeah. What I remembered from watching it years ago is the Empty Planet was always an episode which stood out to me and was one of my favorites because of how different it was from normal episodes and how unique it was. Mostly because the whole ghost town aesthetic. The main cast is trimmed down, and Sarah's basically barely in it, and it's mostly focused on Rani, Clyde, and Gavin, who's a side character.
Yes.
And on a rewatch, I definitely think it still holds up. I don't think it's one of the absolute best from the show, like I originally said, but I do still think it's a really great episode.
Absolutely, I think I completely agree, because I was intrigued when I was going on to BBC iPlayer, because I was like, I wonder what series this is. Surely it's not like series 1 or series 2 when the show is relatively new, because I know it's only like really maybe 3 or 4 locations across the story, but the actual scale of the production for this one must have been so much more than, for example, The Temptation of Sarah Jane Smith, because you have to close whole roads to film this story. And the shot that really stood out for me as a kid was the one where they were looking over the city and there was like no activity going on, and I thought that's such a beautiful shot. Green screen maybe, I don't know.
I always marvel at like these like ghost town stories. It's usually virus stories series like 28 Days Later. I'm going to be bringing up 28 Days Later quite a bit, so just be prepared, because that's the best example I can think of. But it's like just the way they can actually portray just the dead city is always so impressive. I always gawk at how they did it, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did notice a few times, especially as like a filmmaking student, just checking out now, that every now and again I was like, okay, that place, for example, where in the cliffhanger of episode 1, when I think it's Clyde goes towards that gate through the alleyway into that gate, and then he gets trapped and cornered off. I was like, I highly doubt that alleyway is anywhere near the high street they were just at. That he just ran from.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that I just now notice, especially with kids shows, especially with the script. So I just think, maybe this could be better. But then again, we could criticize this episode, or the story, should I say, to the hilt, if we were being really, really critical, because it's a children's show, of course. So naturally,
yeah, I think that is an important thing to keep in mind, that this is a kids show, so we do need to treat it like a kids show. Well, we don't need to treat it like a kids show, because you know, kids shows, a lot of them are very mature and don't treat their audience like idiots and stuff. But obviously, there's some things kids shows like just can't do, and there's and obviously a lot of kids shows have just generally a smaller budget than like big dramas and stuff. So I'd say for a kids show budget, I think they pulled off the aesthetic very well overall.
Yeah. But going back to the scripts for one moment, we reviewed, I believe it was The Day of the Clown, the Odd Bob episode, last series of this podcast, and I only really pointed out like one or two bits of dialogue that I kind of didn't really like, whereas this time there was quite a bit of dialogue that I just thought, this ain't it. And it's like, you know how they said, oh, this doesn't make any sense about 20 times across the story. I just think, okay, maybe in the real life situation, you would say that. You'd be completely perplexed and you just wouldn't be able to put the dots together. But it doesn't really translate, like being super realistic onto screen. And it just seemed to me like lazy, padded writing, if that makes sense. Like, we never really got anywhere with it until part 2.
I think for me the one bit of dialogue which I didn't really like, which always sticks out in my mind, is where I think it's like in like late part 1, where Clyde jokingly says like, oh, maybe they've gotten rid of the world to start humanity again with us two, and it's like, I don't know, Clyde, like, he is generally a funny guy, but something about that joke just feels really like inappropriate in the situation they're in. It just doesn't feel like something Clyde would say.
No, to be fair, I think quite a few times in the episode it kind of does hint at a romance between Clyde and Ronnie, which I didn't.
Yeah, I don't mind them like the romance, but just the way he said that just was a bit weird, especially because starting humanity again, that's weirdly sexual when they're minors. It's just, I just find it quite weird.
Oh, of course, yeah, they're minors in this episode, aren't they? They're like 15, 16. Yeah, good point, actually. Yeah, because then again, at the end, it's like, oh, for a moment there, I thought we were going to be the only 2 people left on Earth, and I was like, oh, okay, we're bringing this back up again. We go full circle. But yeah, otherwise, dialogue wasn't too bad, but I just don't really like the performance. Well, I thought the main cast were quite brilliant, so Ronnie and Clyde. I'm not sure if the actor's name's Angie Mahindra, is that the name? But nevertheless, I didn't particularly like the side cast, and that's literally just one person in this episode. It's Gavin. I thought his delivery of some of the lines was really pantomimey, and then especially at the end when he's kind of getting teleported and like the really heroic music pipes up, and then he's just like, oh, this wasn't my home, not really, but this is your world, they're so lucky to have you. I just thought this is a bit cringe. But again, children's show.
It felt like at point it was like a kid's production or like a kid's school production or something. Yeah. If it was though, I want to see that. That'd be the most interesting school production ever.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like a kid's school production, but on the big screen, which is nice. But again, it's just like that final 5 minutes is like really corny. What's the name?
I'll just quickly say the actors. Daniel Anthony played Clyde, and Anjali Mahindra, I'm probably butchering that she played Ronnie.
Okay, well, Clyde, Clyde's actor, I thought he was brilliant as ever, and I think he is like a stellar actor, and I'm so sad that he hasn't actually made it. Like, if you're watching this episode, for whatever reason, I do apologize, but your career hasn't really taken off. But I do think he should have done, because he's such a brilliant actor, and I think he steals the light of this episode, in my opinion. Don't you think? What do you think of the performance?
Yeah, I think But for me, I think, in my opinion, Clyde is my favorite character from the Sarah Jane Adventures. Like, no contest. Like, I love all of them, but it's just something about Clyde. He's just, he's got the likability, but he's also, he's got the relatability, and he also brings up a good point. It is, connected to this episode, because in this episode they show off some of his artwork in the first scene.
Yeah.
It just hammers home the fact that Clyde is a bright lad. He's just not the most academic kid around. It's just. I always just like the fact that they made him like that, because it just shows that, he's a smart guy. He's just not academic. It's basically exposing the problems with the school system.
Especially.
And
it's like he is his own character outside of Sarah Jane, so at least when he goes home, he does do these artworks. And yes, they're villains. Like, I think it was the Shanchief, one of them, that he was drawing.
Yeah.
And it's like, at least he is his own person outside of Sarah Jane. He's this artist and creative. And I believe the artwork actually comes to life in the story. I can't quite remember, but it actually feeds into
Mona Lisa's revenge. He gets shown off in the thing, and Mona Lisa takes a Sontaran gun from one of his pictures.
Of course, yeah, that's probably. And I think I've mentioned this in the past, but the Revenge of Mona Lisa, I think the story is called. That gave me absolute nightmares as a kid. I hated that story. I think
it's really fun. It's silly, but it's so fun.
And Saran Jones is in it as Mona Lisa, isn't she? So.
Yeah, she is, yeah.
Yeah, I should watch that one. Well, it's on iPlayer, it's a perfect opportunity to...
I've been rewatching it back from Series 1. I rewatched Eye of the Golden earlier today, actually.
Okay. But speaking of characters that were in this one but aren't necessarily the OGs, Maria's dad, I was absolutely gutted when he wasn't in this one, because as opposed to him, we had... I think his name was Rahesh. Rani's father's name is Rahesh. And just to point this out there, I really think from the camera work and the cinematography perspective here, I don't know if it was just me, but for some reason, there was very, or in most cases, no headroom in the shots. So there was no room above the heads of the characters. It was such close-ups and shoddy camera work. I just felt like we were missing a few inches on the top and to the sides. Did you get that impression? It felt too zoomed in.
That is just generally with anything. That's always one of my pet peeves. A load of unnecessary close up, just there. That's one of my pet peeves with some Chibnall stories, like Survivors of the Flux. It's just so much close up, and it's not necessary. I wasn't really paying attention to the close ups and stuff, because I was just too taken aback by the far shots of the deserted town and everything.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, and I think they did a good job at explaining away why there were no cars crashed or there was no planes in the sky. They actually factored that into the script, and of course that was a budget problem, but also kind of feeds into the plot as well, because they don't want anyone to get hurt, and of course that makes sense because they didn't want the heir and the son to get hurt as well. So I guess that makes sense. So it actually has narrative purpose. But in reality, it's just to cover some production flaws. But
if it didn't happen, then they'd be going on for weeks about how every single plane just crashed and stuff. And I think it does make sense to just do that, because that would have been one of my. If they didn't explain that, that would have been one thing I mentioned. So what happened to those in planes and stuff?
Yeah.
And
I mean, it's like a can of worms. You could then talk about all the power, the nuclear reactors, how come they're not going off or stuff like that. But then it's they're trying to protect the area, so they've made these kind of reassurances with themselves to not harm this kid. Well, so whatever.
Although there is one problem with the narrative, which I do have a slight problem with. And it basically, at the end of the story, they say that everyone's clocks skipped ahead by an hour and a half, and I'm just thinking, so the events of this story only took an hour and a half. That seems like a really, really short time. I thought I was thinking 5 hours at the very least. I get that.
Especially at the start when Ronnie's investigating and you think there may be a few jump cuts, and then in the story just cut time, and then especially when they run out onto that the car park block, and then they look over the city that surely must have taken about quarter of an hour, 20 minutes to get up there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, let's go from Bannerman Road, which is in the suburbs, to the centre of London. That's probably probably not the quickest drive, especially when they can't call for a cab or get a train or anything. But that'll be like a solid 30-40 minute walk, I'd say.
I mean,
that's being generous.
We can put the pacing problems, well, not problems, but the pacing down to part 2, especially because there's a countdown, and it's only like a half-hour countdown, so it kind of makes sense that it's only an hour 30 into the future for the people that disappeared. However, part 1, I do agree, it may have been spaced out a little bit better in terms of the time, maybe like 3 hours, something like that, just because part 2 takes across half hour, just like the episode duration, whereas part 1, they do jump around a little bit, and you just think, okay, maybe this takes up a little bit of time, but I never even noticed the clock going forward. So was it a big part of the plot at the end, or was it just like
Ronnie's dad, I already forgot his name, but yeah, he was just said like, it's been all over the news. It's like all the clocks have just skipped ahead by an hour and a half.
I mean, he was a principal, right? He was a principal of the school.
Yeah.
I assumed he'd have a bit more authority in terms of, okay, what's he going to do in terms of like the welfare of the children? Like, is he going to close the school? Is he going to do this, that? And he's just...
I hope he closes the school, because if it really only lasted an hour and a half, that means Maria and Clyde did all that work. They're probably already absolutely shattered, and then they have to go into school.
Absolutely, and it's just like it's this traumatic experience, but it's like it never really gets a reference afterwards. It's just like, okay, everyone's back to normal, isn't this lovely? Maybe there could have been something else there, but we are skipping ahead. Should we go to part 1, make our way through, and then go into part 2?
Yeah, we should probably. We've talked about it pretty generally.
Yeah, of course. So part 1, of course, starts with Mr. Smith tracking this alien signal. Then the very next day, they'd all disappear. And then one part of this that I didn't really kind of get was that, that Ronnie calls Clyde to try and get contact with someone. What I don't understand is why then, after she went to the attic, she went home. Or like she went to like her neighbour's house first and then home, as opposed to just going round to Clyde's house, which is just round the corner. Like, she needs to...
My guess is that it's just like...
plot.
My guess is that maybe the sequence was in a different order and it just got re-edited for pacing reasons or something.
No, I do agree. I think it was either that or the script. And I think with Dave the Clown, I did notice a little bit where it was kind of rehashed in the edit and like noticeably reworked, and I think that's very possibly done again here. Maybe they did that common with the Sarah Jane Adventures, I don't know. I don't really know the production of it, but yeah.
I mean, for me it's not really a big deal, because if it means like more time spent just like with Rani alone, and just the sense of fear of being on your own in the whole planet, I think that is more important than like the plot, because the tension where Ronnie's just on her own and screaming for people and no one's there, I think that is like truly top tier, really creepy, honestly.
But nevertheless, back to the Empty Planet Part 1. I thought, I do completely agree with you that it was nice to have those scenes with Ronnie, especially at the start when she's kind of like getting accustomed to the thing. But just before that, she's reading The Great Expectations, then her father comes in and then she goes to bed. Why is she crying when she goes to bed? When she turns out the lights, why is she noticeably crying? Is The Great Expectations a sad book? I'm not sure, I've never read it.
I don't know, I never read it. I'm not the biggest reader.
Maybe it was just another case of editing, I don't know, lazy direction in terms of directing the actress what to do.
I didn't notice anything.
Okay, but she was just like, get out of my room to her father, and then the very next scene she was like crying. I was like, okay, maybe that means she regrets how she's like acting towards her father. Like her father actually had an attempt to speak to her, and then she was just like, I'm really busy with this book, could you leave now please? So maybe she kind of regretted that, but it was never really obtuse to the point where it kind of can be implied. So like I'm just like joining dots that may not actually be there, so it's just like I don't know what's going on there, but nevertheless.
But in the words of Paul McGann, human beings always seeing patterns in things which aren't there.
Absolutely. I'm just saying that just to avoid a criticism, but otherwise, what do you think of part 1?
Overall, I think part 1 is definitely better than part 2. I just think just generally in terms of pacing and atmosphere, and the creep factor and the dynamic between Rani and Clyde, I think it's top tier Sarah Jane Adventures. Obviously the mystery of Gavin starts to the seeds start to be sown here, and I'm not that big on Gavin, as we already said. He's just not that interesting, and he's best acted. But in general, I do think part 1 is really, really great.
Yeah, I do agree. And I think the thing with Gavin is because a point I touched upon earlier, like some of the dialogue was definitely padding for me. And so when we did eventually get on to Gavin about 15 minutes into part 1, I was like, thank God we've actually got something to latch on to now. And, I really liked, I think it was part 1 or it may have been part 2 actually, the scene where Clyde goes into the mannequin shop and then he stands as a mannequin and you have the robot inspecting him. That's such a creepy shot. They moved really, really quickly, so at least they had some menace that way.
Yeah, because a lot of robots are like, slower than my gran.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but it's like they actually move at a decent pace.
Yeah, and it's like when Clyde and Ronnie are running, then you have a jump cut to the next scene, and then they're right behind him, and I think, oh crap, so they actually do move at quite a fair pace, and I thought, yeah, that's quite menacing, that's quite good. And in part 2, you're not really...
That's a good thing, because
Sorry?
Humanity would be screwed if they moved at a slow pace, because they wouldn't be able to get to Gavin in time.
Oh, absolutely, and even at the end, it's like the final 30 seconds, it's like, oh, are they going to return the humans or not? It's like, okay, this is like Cold War, you know what I mean? Okay, you've had one resolution, but now you're just going to drag it out for another minute to see
that's
the stakes.
Always annoying in any bit of media when they do that.
Yeah, and they did it again here, and I was just like, But again, this was 2008, maybe? It's
actually, no, wait, no, it was 2011 because it was in Series 4, and that's that one.
Oh, crap. Oh, of course, Death the Doctor is in that series. Yeah, it must be 2011. Crap, I didn't realise this was actually that recent. To be fair, for the time, it still aged up really well. There was no really noticeable moments, except from the script, and, we can criticise the writer as much as we want. So, Gareth Roberts, mate, terrible script. But otherwise, it was a really solid episode. But yeah, that covers episode 1, I think, unless you have any more notes for episode 1?
No, I'd say we might as well just move on to episode 2, and then we can, properly go into, the main plot, because, the plot really, picks up around episode 2.
Of course, but before we go to the plot, I have quite a funny, weird thing to nitpick this episode with. In the, the previously trailer at the start of the episode...
Oh, yeah.
Where it recaps the events of part 1, I find it really bizarre that just before it goes into the title sequence, it picks up the bit of dialogue where Ronnie talks about, being adventurous with Sarah Jane, and then maybe this is the moment that it kind of bites them on the bum, and then it goes straight into the title sequence, and I thought that's such a weird line of dialogue to kind of pick from for the pre-title recap, you know what I mean?
To be honest, I didn't notice that because I always just skip the previous one because I watched the episodes back to back. I don't need a previously recap.
Yeah, fair enough. But again, it was like Aliens of London syndrome as well with the Next Time trailer because, you have this really big cliffhanger of are they going to die? And then it literally says the Sarah Jane Adventures next time. And then it's like Clyde running away and escaping. And I just think, oh, well, thank you for ruining the next part.
I understand doing Next Time trailers between two stories, but why do it between the two episodes in that story? It never made sense to me, and I always just skip through them because I don't want spoilers. I've seen all the Sarah Jane Adventures before, but I still don't want spoilers.
Absolutely, that's a show. Just you could have a Next Time trailer between episodes, for the in part 1 for part 2, for example, but at least don't show the spoilers of them literally escaping the cliffhanger. But like you said, the plot really, really ramps up, and I'm literally watching the clip that I referenced a few minutes ago about the mannequin scene. That is indeed in part 2, and yeah, I think the yellow one especially kind of stands out as a bit too colourful. It just doesn't look good.
Yeah,
yellow Dalek.
At least the red one is red. It feels more traditional than bright yellow. It's it's kind of, I guess you can do it you could compare it to cars because plenty of people have red cars and it looks elegant, but when you have a bright yellow car, it looks kind of.
What the hell?
How do I put this?
Midlife crisis.
Transformers fan or something.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the very picture that I sent to you, the grey one would have worked really well, I think. The red and the grey.
Yeah, the grey and red one. That would have been good.
Yeah, I just don't think the yellow works. It makes it look like, Ant-Man and the Wasp. It looks like the Wasp from Ant-Man and the Wasp. That's effectively it. But nevertheless, what did you think of the Son and Heir plot? Because, I quite like it. I thought it is sound. And I do especially like how we get that flashback to the original planet that Gavin's from. It felt very Torchwood-esque. And the budget kind of ramped up for that a little bit, it seemed.
Yeah, it's like that like it's weird to think that this one like 2 second clip just makes you care about it a bit more because it's not just some faceless, nameless planet in the far reaches of Andromeda. It's like it's an actual like it's an actual place, and it makes you like think. It makes you look at it, makes you care about it, and it's like, oh, all right, do what you have to do. And it's like, I do think the plot is quite interesting. I just wish Gavin was a bit less Canto-esque and school kidding.
Yeah, I mean, in part one, I think it was mostly down to the dialogue. It was like, what are you doing here? Get out of my room and shit like that. But then in part two, it was more of a case of like that final 5 minutes where he has that epic monologue. Like, I think it's much more likable in part two than in part one, just because he actually kind of understands, because you have that scene where he's like looking at the countdown. Well, not the countdown at that point. It's just like really alien text, and he's like, well, you guys are talking gibberish, this is gibberish, I'm kind of more accepting of this now. And then he's a little less annoying, but then at the end with that monologue, it kind of reverts back to part one in a more obtuse way, and that's why I just don't really like his character. But in part two, he's definitely more likable than in part one.
I've got two things I want to say about Gavin real quick, actually. First of all, I don't really want to, like, I'm trying not to be, like, mean to him saying, he wasn't the best actor, because he was, like, 13 or something when he did this, and, child acting is never really that good. Like, the exception is, like, Pan's Labyrinth or something. That's one which comes to mind. Yeah, I can forgive him for that.
However, back to the empty planet, what do you think of the base HQ? I really loved the scene where, like, the robots just went through the glass and broke it. Like, I thought that was a really good action little bit.
I just like the idea that they just found a random cafe and was like, this will do as the HQ. It's got food, it's got drink, it's got tables. This will do. I just like that. It's like, if I was in that situation, I'd probably pick like a restaurant or a cafe to go in, because it's got all the supplies you need.
Exactly, and I think a lot of these empty worlds kind of stories, the first thing people think of is like, the Sparkle Mystery. Have you watched that?
No, I haven't. I haven't even heard of it. Sorry.
You need to get on that. That was CBBC. That was a fantastic show. But then nevertheless, any single time they have this like world, everyone's gone except for Mew's story. The first idea everyone has is to shoplift, or to go get and hoard objects and stuff. This episode, the story should I say, they go into a cafe to get some food, but at least they have the touch of, okay, we're not going to steal anything because Clyde's put some money onto the desk for when the people come back, if they come back. So I appreciate that little touch, because it really,
I like the
like PG.
Like the line Clyde says, I would have never done. I never would have done that pre Sarah Jane. It just shows his like.
Yeah,
just generally like these simple like bunker HQ areas in these stories. I don't know. I always like them. Again, bringing up 28 days later. It's like the first shelter was just like it was like a corner shop. It was just a barricaded up corner shop, and they just hung out there and ate a load of sugar just to keep themselves going.
I mean, they never actually ate anything in this episode, did they? Like, we saw Clyde bring out these two, like, plates of food, but they never actually eat it. It's just like, okay, plot time, they're outside again. And I think, okay, did they actually eat the food? It's like a tiny little bit. I just think, did they actually eat that?
If the episode only lasted an hour and a half, then they couldn't have been that hungry. Unless it really was, like, a day plus an hour and a half, but we never saw nights, so I don't think that's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like that moment where Ronnie went to bed crying. I was like, okay, maybe that could have been edited later into the episode, and it was like a more large scale production in terms of like in time frame. Like maybe it was split over 2 days, and part one is 1 day, part two is primarily set on day two, where the plot actually comes in. But no, it's just like no. But yeah, I'm just intrigued if they actually ate their food, or it's a really small point. But speaking of scenes in the cafe, I really liked when Ronnie said "what," and then the robot did that kind of reaction by leaning back. It's like, how rude of you by saying that. I really liked how the robots had a little bit of humanity, and especially when Clyde actually took him through the the newspaper, and then they were reading.
Oh yeah, they mentioned like Lady Gaga and stuff.
Yeah, Lady Gaga, the backbenchers, Brent's Got Talent, stuff like that. I just thought, nice references there. Like Closing Time. Closing Time was also written by Gareth Roberts, but you know what I mean, where they just go through a paper and read about pop culture and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's kind of what it reminded me of. There's Gareth Roberts trope if you needed one. But otherwise, I did like the Son and Nair plotline. It kind of was intriguing up to the point where they actually went into the park, and then the park kind of lets it down. But otherwise, I really liked the concept of, it's like the biodamper in the Runaway Bride of that protective ring that he has on that kind of hides him from the aliens. And it's like, okay, so he's like, and again, fear her. It's like that Isolus thing, goes to Earth, and it's just like happy on Earth. And it's like that kind of story. And I do appreciate that they did that for the Sarah Jane Adventures. And unfortunately, it was another crappy child actor like in Fear Her. Apologies to the guy if you're listening to this. But I didn't.
And apologies to the and apologise to the girl from Fear Her. I do feel bad for her because she was just a kid.
She was just a kid, I know, and I was like, if I was a child actor, I would have been atrocious. So yeah, fair play for actually getting onto TV when you were a kid, I guess. But yeah.
That moment when you realise that the new companion is only 2 years older than you and done way more in their life.
Yeah, I'm older than the new companion by like 6 or 7, oh no, like a year pretty much. I just thought, god damn, what the hell am I doing? I'm making Doctor Who game shows. How dare the companion be 1 year younger than me? I mean,
back to Empty Planet.
Back to the Empty Planet. What did you think of part 2?
I say overall, I don't think it was as good as part 1 because I just feel like, I felt like the mystery and the atmosphere was better than the actual, the story itself. But I do think it was still enjoyable. It was still enjoyable throughout. The very ending was a bit, whimsical and, a bit cheesy. But it was an enjoyable episode, just not as good as part 1. But I'd say overall... Actually, no, I won't go into overall just yet, but episode 2, another great one.
Yeah, and I would say part 2 is probably the better story because I think part 1 is definitely a really good setup for the isolation of Ronnie and Clyde. I do think it was a little bit repetitive here and there with the dialogue, but again, that's a writing problem as opposed to the production because I thought the production couldn't have been better in part 1 and part 2. I just thought the scenery was just beautiful, the location work very nice, and the actual park they went to at the end, it was pretty stunning even though it was only really under a tree. But then in the background you had all the bushes and it was a really nice landscape, and I can understand why he would go there. Gavin, it was his place of refuge and relaxation.
Exactly. It seems like a place I would go.
Yeah, it's a really nice place, so I can understand the the location rec here for choosing that place, and yeah, it really worked. So yeah, I would say part 2 is a superior one just because the plot actually takes some strides forward, and I think the most memorable scenes are from this one. So I would say part 2 is superior, and I don't really have any more to say about it. It's not much to say because there's not really much to the story. But one last thing, actually, just because it has poked up on my player, I really like the transition of Clyde stepping out into the road and then a car coming up across him and then him stepping back and then all the people are back. I thought that was a really, really great transition of showing all the people returning. And also, I forgot to mention this in part 1, I really liked how they kind of portrays the isolation of Ronnie and Clyde by really ramping up the wind in the sound mix. It's like when there's no dialogue, there's just wind, and I really likes that kind of western vibe of damn, there's nothing here, you're deserted. I really likes that element of it. And yeah,
just super quiet in general. Just when you're in the middle of the city, you don't hear any cars whatsoever. It's so eerie and creepy, and again, that's why I love.
Exactly, it's when Ronnie told Clyde to be quiet and then you just hear the ambience of the room. You could be really corny and just cut out all the ambience, but what would you hear in that situation? You would hear the ambience of the room. So I'm glad they kept that in the sound mix. So yeah, high praise to the sound. Right, Jamie, do you have any final notes?
No, I don't really have any final notes. Do you want to go to overall thoughts, or do you have any final notes?
I don't have any more notes, but before we do go on to the conclusions / overall notes and also the score that we're going to give this episode out of 10, I think we should head over to the audience interaction section. We've only got 2. We've got Michael Wilson and we've got Andrew Hayden. So, Jamie, who would you like to hear from first, Michael or Andrew?
Well, I've already read Andrew, so I'll hear Michael's one because I haven't heard it yet.
Yeah, okay. He says, I can barely remember it. The son and air thing was clever. The robots were shite and obviously recycled from an old game show, of course the one I referenced earlier. The kids acted their little socks off, and that was pretty much it. He didn't give me a score because he can barely remember it, but otherwise Andrew Hayden said, it's a really enjoyable episode. Them being on a planet with no one was really interesting, and I liked the friendship between Clyde and Ronnie, which we didn't particularly like. It was nice to have an episode with the two of them together, I guess.
I think generally it was strong. It was just the odd bit of, it was just like the occasional bit of dialogue, but in general, like, their dynamic was strong throughout. So that's kind of like, that's applicable for like basically every episode. The only difference is that they've got a bottle cast this time round, so they don't have Sarah to bounce off of. But they've always been great together. They've done like, they've had stories where they were working together, and it's no different here. Their dynamic, but I just think it's strong throughout, basically.
Absolutely. But nevertheless, Andrew goes on to say, the robots are basic but serviceable, but I find the Gavin stuff a little bit forced. We don't know who he is yet. He's treated as incredibly important. I do agree with that. But I do think the Son and Heir storyline that comes up in part 2 does warrant it. And I don't think it makes that much of a deal being this important thing, especially not in part 1. And in part 2, it kind of makes sense because, layers of the plot are coming on. So it makes sense for him to have a little bit more stakes towards him. But otherwise, I don't really like the fact as well that we don't really see Elizabeth Sladen, especially in the latter half of part 2. We don't even see her at the end, do we? It's just Rash.
No, we do see it. They reunite and they have like heart to heart. Sarah makes them both a cup of tea for saving the world and everything.
Did I even watch the end of part 2? Holy crap!
I guess it's not, because you missed a lot. You missed a lot of stuff.
Oh, I didn't watch the end of part 2. I didn't watch the final 5 minutes. Damn it! My bad. Crap.
I feel like I can excuse, I feel like in a lot of like series 4, there was some, like, Sarah wasn't always prevalent. Like, the next episode is Out of Time, I think. That's the cast split up throughout, and Sarah isn't in all of the story because the screen time's kind of like split equal and stuff. And I don't know why she is, but maybe it had something to do with her health at this point. Maybe actually.
But nevertheless, I clearly haven't watched the final 5 minutes of part 2, so you can completely invalidate my score if you really want to, if you feel I'm being a little bit too harsh or a little bit too lenient, either way. But I don't really have a conclusion, so I'll just go to a score. Jamie, do you have a conclusion?
I'll just briefly summarize what I've said. I think it's got great atmosphere, great production in general, just the ghost town and everything, great soundscape, and your story's interesting. Gavin's not amazing, but Ronnie and Clyde are both fantastic. Robots are funky, but they're enjoyable enough, and it's an enjoyable story. I feel like it's a creepy one. I feel like it's a comfort one. I would go back to and rewatch happily, because it's just it's memorable, but it's it's not upsetting or anything. It's quite simple, and I just think it's an enjoyable time. It's not perfect, but I'd give it like an 8 out of 10, I'd say.
An 8 out of 10, okay, very fair. I shall chuck that onto the average calculator because I'm bad at math. But nevertheless, that's enough about score. Right, the Empty Planet. I'm a little bit more harsh on this one than you. I don't think the script is particularly strong. I don't think Gareth Roberts did a really good job in this story, and I don't think it holds up in terms of the writing as much as The Day of the Clown or the The Death of the Doctor. I think they have much superior scripts. However, what this episode does have going for it is definitely the production value. I do rate the fact that they literally just shot off several roads for this story. I rate the location work. It's very pretty. I'm not sure if some of the scenes are green screen, especially the one where they looked out in the city. I assume it's green screen, but it looks really good, especially for the time. So if it was green screen, bravo to the guy who did the key to that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the performances on the whole are quite good, except for Gavin. Sorry, Gavin actor. But I would give this story a mid 5 out of 10. I don't hate it by any means, but I just don't think it's particularly strong in terms of the writing, which massively lets it down for me. And it's just built up because of the performances and because of the production, but the writing for me is quite bad. But it's just, especially in part 1. Yeah, I think we've spoken about it enough, but that means you give it an 8, I give it a 5, and that brings the average to a 6.5 out of 10. And I think I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that's a fairly fair score for the MC Planet.
Yeah, that's more fair than a 5 out of 10.
I don't know. I'll be intrigued to know what people think on Twitter. I'm going to try and gauge the reaction of the Empty Planet. I'm just going to search it up on Twitter to see what people are saying about it. But Jamie, that wraps up our review of the Empty Planet. So next week, speaking of bad child actors, and speaking of which, we have made reference to this episode in this episode. It is what, Jamie? Do you know?
Is it Fear Her?
It is indeed Fear Her, which was my bad episode that got spun. So I am really, really dreading rewatching that story. But by the sounds of it, you don't mind that one before a rewatch, of course.
No, I don't think it's that bad. Like, it's not good, but I get some like ironic appeal out of it. Like, I think it's quite funny in places. You can thank Doctor Who poop for most of that. I'll just say that right off. Some of the ironic appeal is thanks to Doctor Who poop, but I don't think it's the absolute worst thing ever. Absolute spawn of state saying I think New Earth is the worst Tennant story like right now.
I thought New Earth was quite decent. We're like opposite ends of the spectrum there, because I quite like New Earth. Well, actually, no, I think it's quite a decent episode. I know Mike loves it. Mike thinks it's like a 10 out of 10. I think, Michael, what the hell are you on about? Like, I would definitely be more on your side of the fence than Michael's side of the fence with New Earth, but I thought it was decent. But then again, I've not rewatched in like 4 years, so maybe my opinions will evolve. But who knows?
Yeah, I'll rewatch. I'll rewatch Fear Her on Friday probably.
But that's upcoming in the series, so please do stick around for that. Please like, subscribe, comment, and we'll see you next week. Jamie, pleasure recording with you again. See you next week. Bye.
Me too.
Take care, guys.